That's fine. All right. So I'm talking about Long Demeanor. We're going to kind of talk about the structure of Black Thursday, this kind of sales engine project. And like when we think about it, like the way this kind of project is structured is that we have this sales engine object that kind of sits at the top at a very simplified level, right? And today I'm just going to be talking about two kind of legs of this this thing. And when we have the sales engine object, we also have like the repository objects. So in this case, we have an item repository and a merchant repository. Like to use two different things. And then these repositories are what we have to kind of to handle like what we call the model level objects. So like for the item repository, we have all the items, those are I's.
Hey, Mike, just wanted to jump in. We can't see what you're writing on.
Whiteboard. Why does it say paused?
There we go. All good now.
And in the merchant repository, is responsible for the merchant objects. So it's M's. Right. And so the idea here is that like, you know, yeah, like at the beginning of this, we're just creating kind of the structure. The item repository should be able to like find items for us, et cetera, et cetera. And if we look at the data of like the items and the merchant objects, we can see that items have an ID. And just let me make sure I have this correct in my head. Yeah, items have a merchant ID, and the picture is that these items are linked. In that, when we look at an item, that merchant ID in the CSV, that is a reference to the merchant, the ID of a merchant from the other CSV. So that's how like all these things are kind of linked together. And this is like the idea behind this kind of application is like, well, if I have an item here, how can I go make sure I get the right merchant, right? And I think that what an initial kind of reaction to this is like, well, I will just, you know, instantiate a copy of merchant repository for this item. And, you know, now I can just like every single time I have a thing, I just, hey, you know, hey, item, I'll ask my merchant repository, give me the right merchant. And we, you know, that means that we have to do that for all the items. Right? And that gets, but, you know, then we do that, each merchant repository here has to have the merchants again, has to recreate that. And then we can see like how this can both get messy and unnecessary, right? So when we think about it, every single time we spin up this merchant repository or this item repository, it's got to go and make item objects and merchant objects. And the more we do that, the more unwieldy our application gets, which I would call that less than optimal, right? And so what's the consequence? Like what is the solution? What do we think like some other problems that this could be? Will, what do you think?
I mean, besides being messy, like I was just thinking it would take forever to do anything.
Yeah, totally. Alexa?
If you create a merchant not from the CSV file, I don't think it would be called when you when you build the merchant repository.
Exactly. Like, yeah. Go ahead.
That was it.
Was that it? Okay. Yeah. So like if we have, or like maybe perhaps not just that we are adding more merchants or whatever, but what if we update it, right? So we have a merchant with ID 1 over here, and we have a merchant with ID 1 over here, and potentially a merchant with ID 1 over here, and we update one, like there's two potential issues here. One is that we don't know which one's the real one. Two, we have to go and update for all of them, which is kind of gross, right? And then this is like that's one like an obvious kind of like, I don't want to say obvious because that's kind of like condescending and shitty to say, but like that is an upfront consequence to happen, is like things get slower, things get more complex. But another kind of consequence is that testing gets bad. Can you imagine what it'd have to be like if for testing like just a single merchant, we have to load up the item repository, the merchant repository, the other 5 repositories that we've created, right? Like why do I have to load up my entire data set if I'm just going to, I just want to test a merchant? Like a merchant test should just deal with the merchanty things, the things that merchants should do. An item test should just be dealing with the things about the items. Like we should not want to kind of care about anything else. And so we have to get to this idea of like, it's like Ghostbusters. We don't want to cross the streams, right? We won't want this over here, talking over this person over here. We want this one going over here and talking to a person that is like what we want to avoid. And so what we're doing here, like we call this class traversing verticals, because essentially this here's a vertical, this here's a vertical, and we want communication to happen between the two, but we don't want to weave this kind of like gross kind of web where everything's interlinked together and everything depends on everything else, right? Like this idea is like we're trying to avoid these complex dependencies. Can I go ahead and erase this lovely piece of abstract art that I have before you? I'll give you 3 seconds to screenshot it and save it and make it your wallpaper for your phone, but I will delete it as soon as I can find the controls for the whiteboard, which is hidden for me. Why? There we go. Clear. Cool, I have a blank whiteboard. Do you have a blank whiteboard as well? Excellent. So I'm just gonna go ahead and recreate So the example I'm going to use is that I would like each individual item to have a method called, an instance method called merchant name. And this merchant name will return me a string that matches that merchant, whoever merchant that item belongs to. And so the kind of theoretical thing that we were talking about previously was that, well, an item should like instantiate a merchant repository. The merchant repository will then load up the CSV file and then create merchant objects. I'm like, no, that sounds so gross. So, oops, ignore that, undo, yes. So when we look at this diagram, if I'm an item, who do I know? Who's my next link over? The item repository, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to have the item speak to the item repository. And now the item repository is going to be like, well, I know about like this item's like, hey, I'm item number 7. I would like to know, who my merchant is. Item repository is going to be like, well, I'd like to thank you for giving me your ID number, but I don't know anything about merchants. And so who here, like the item repository, well, I don't know anything about merchants, but I do know a person, right? And that person is the sales engine. So the item repository is then going to ask the sales engine, like, hey, sales engine, I've got this I'm sorry, I got this wrong. The item knows its merchant ID, and so the the item says like, hey, I have this merchant ID. I'd like to know its name. Item repository says like, thank you for this merchant ID. I don't know anything about merchants, but I'll pass it up to my friend Sales Engine, and I'll give him this merchant ID, and it will, give me an answer. So the Sales Engine is like, well, thank you for this merchant ID. I don't know anything about merchants. But as to quote to use the cliche phrase, but I know a guy. So the Sales Engine knows like, hey, I have a merchant ID. I need to find the merchant. I'm going to ask my friend Merchant Repository. So Merchant Repository is like, you need to know about merchants? I know things about merchants. You have an ID? Great, give me the ID, takes the ID, and then returns the merchant object back up to the Sales Engine. Sales Engine is like, cool. Hey, item repository, here's that merchant you asked for. Item repository is like, cool. Hey, item, here's that merchant object you wanted. And that merchant, the item's like, cool, I have this merchant object, I can just grab its name. And I hope I did not accidentally say invoice or invoice item in there by accident, because they all start with an I. I meant to say item the entire time through, and I hope I said item the entire time through. Cool. It's very difficult when it's like you have invoices, items, and then invoice items. That does not help understanding at all. But that is like the business terms for it. Jake?
So at a high level,
I just dropped my water bottle and scared the shit out of myself.
it's the least scary thing happening right now.
Yeah.
So obviously Ruby, object-oriented programming, everything's an object, yada, yada, yada.
Mm-hmm.
This seems to be more of like a functional programming concept. Would that be correct? Like you're just like passing like a football until you get to the right place and like passing it back?
I don't.
Am I way off?
The thing is that like, I am honestly not that experienced in functional programming. So like, I do not like, that is not what comes to mind. This feels OOP to me because it's really like kind of this idea of encapsulation, right? Is that things don't know about everything else. It knows its own little place, and it asks friends. And I think it becomes a little more OOP once I explain like how things talk to each other. Cool. So I think like, let's put a pin in that, and let's make sure, remind me to revisit that when we kind of like get to the end, and hopefully it'll kind of make more sense, because I don't think that like we were seeing the full picture yet.
Yeah, it's also maybe not the most relevant to like actually accomplishing what we're trying to do.
Cool. But I still want to revisit and make sure that we know that clear. So now we have this thing, okay, we're sending messages, we're going up and down this tree, right? We're not crossing out. And the advantage of this is that this becomes a lot more simple, not simple, but like it becomes less complex, because if code has to change, we only have to change it in fewer places, right? So let us say that the merchant repository has that, what was it called? Like, I think it was called find by ID. I think that's how the method looks. Yes. If we were to change this out to just arbitrarily, can you hear my dog crunching? Sorry, because I hear it and I'm like, that sounds really loud. She's having breakfast. She eats when she wants to eat, and it's really embarrassing that she just munched it away. If we make a method called find merchant, and if we were to have this set up in a way that we would have that kind of mesh action, we would have to go through and find every single place that merchant repository was referenced and change it from find by ID to find merchant ID, right? Every single place we use the method, we have to go and change. However, if we are sticking to this idea that we only, have this, we have the separation now, we're only limited things talking to each other, this change, we make that change once up here. Right? The sales engine is the only thing accessing it. And that's the only place we need to make a change. That's the only place we need to make changes to tests. Like this idea is that we want to encapsulate things so that they have the least amount of impact on other things when we go, when we make changes. The computer sciencey term for that is that we want to make our code less brittle. Brittle meaning one small thing, it breaks. Other terms that you may hear used is if we want to make our code more resilient to change, and so forth. Cool. And so the idea, what we're talking about when we talk about the law of Demeter is that things should only talk to adjacent objects. This here can only talk to this. This here can only talk to this. This can only talk to this, and so forth up and down the chain. Oops. Questions to this point? Ben?
I just wanted to point out that the last thing you said, just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that the sales engine can talk to only both the repos, not just from the items to the sales to the merchants. The sales has access to both. It was a little confusing at the end there.
Right. Sales engine also has the ability to talk to sales analyst. Cool. So so this can also improve our testing. When we talk about testing, right, and we test these methods that we're creating, we only need to test that the item can talk to the item repository. We only need to test that the item repository can talk to the sales engine. And of course, we do have all the things that test downwards. The idea here is that we want to have, we don't want to load up the entire suite and instantiate all the objects when we're testing. So this is a great opportunity to use our good old friend Mox and Stubs. Once I was teaching about Mox and Stubs, and for some reason I kept calling them Mubs and Socks, and I could not stop saying Mubs and Stocks. And this is the first time I ever mentioned Mubs and Stocks, so the students were looking at me like, "What are you talking about? Mubs and Stocks? Got it." I'm like, "No, it's Mox and Stubs." Mubs and Stocks. And it took me for a while because then I would say Mubs and Stocks to myself. I'm like, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. And then I would say Mox and Stubs. I'm like, no, that doesn't sound right. Get in your own head. All right. And so what does this look like in code, right? And so when we think about it, all right, cool. That sounds straightforward. We're not crossing streams. We're not jumping from over here and going over here. We gotta climb that ladder upwards. This is a ladder, not train tracks. Well, it could be a train. How do we get through that? Let me go ahead and reconfigure. Cool. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent. All right, let me put my tablet away. Oops. Shit. So the big picture is that, like, what I said I wanted to do here is I wanted to make a method called merchant name, and that'll give me the merchant that this this item belongs to. Actually, I'm going to make this the full screen because we're not going to run anything in the terminal. Is this big enough for everyone? Is cool? Let's go one click bigger just to be safe. And the problem here is that, like, well, how am I going to talk to my item repository? Like my item repository made me. In this case, I'll just pull that up so you can see. Split right. And this is just the basic, like, kind of item repository. I have it so that item repository, when it's it gets created, it gets pushed, it gets a path, and the path is just going to create these item objects. And so I'm like, well, an item has no way to refer to the item repository, right? There's no way to talk upwards, right? I can talk downwards, like I can, like, hey, like for example, this find by ID method. I can be like, hey, cool, get all items, find me the item with ID that matches. Like you can see how, and you can see, like, because our sales engine knows about the repositories, it can reach downwards. But the challenge is, how do we go upwards? And we do that by passing a reference to all our objects downwards upon creation. So we'll start at the topmost object, and we have a sales engine. And let me just pull this aside a little bit, make it a little bigger. We have the from CSV method that we talked about. That's a class method, and here we're initializing our repositories. And what we're going to do is that in these repositories, we are going to not only pass it we're not only going to pass the path, the file path to our CSVs, we're going to pass it a reference to ourself. And right here, self is the instance of sales engine. And I'm going to do that again here. Self. So over here in our item repository, when I initialize, I'm going to get the path, and I need this to take a so now what we've done here is that when I create a repository, I pass a reference to my sales engine. So now my item repository can talk to my sales engine if I need to. Great. Now we're going to go down here, and we need to do the same thing from the item repository to the item, right? Essentially what we're doing is that we're making essentially a chain link by link. We've connected the sales engine to the item repository in the upper direction. We always could go downwards. And now what we're doing is that we are connecting the item to the item repository with an upward chain. So what we're going to do here is that item.new is going to we're going to pass self. Now here, the tricky part here is like, well, we pass self here and we pass self here. Self is a dynamic term. It changes. Self is whatever that object is in the context of its location. For example, here in the sales engine file, when I type in self, this self here is referring to this instance of sales engine because it is the sales engine object here. When we're over here, we are in the item repository. So self refers to the item repository, right? It's really important to remember that self is a keyword whose context changes based on where it sits. So now that we've passed into item, when we open up item, nope. Yep, this item. Item takes in the repository like that. And we have access to the repository. So now what I have to do is that now that I have access, that I have the ability to talk upwards, I want to be like, okay, if I need to get the merchant name, I have this ID, I have the merchant ID, right? Because merchant ID is an attribute of an item. I need to ask upwards, hey, get me this merchant. So I'm going to ask my item repository, And right now I'm just doing some like dream-driven development. I'm like, hey, what do I want to ask? What should that method mean? Repository find merchant by ID, and I'm going to pass it merchant ID. Right. And now in item repository, I'm going to go make a method def find merchant by ID. I'll take an ID. And cool. So I'm in my item repository. Who do I have to ask to get the merchant by ID? Katie, what do you think? Who do I ask him?
You'd have to ask the engine.
Yep, exactly. So I'm gonna do engine, and I gotta decide. I gotta make a decision here what I want to call it. Find merchant by ID, and I'm gonna pass it the ID. Cool. And over here, I'm just gonna drag this over here because I want to see them side by side. Because like, if I just flip over, I'll forget exactly what method, what name I wanted to call it. So cool. Def find merchant by ID. It's going to take an ID. And here it gets easier. It's like, okay, so I need to ask the merchant repository. Cool. So merchants. Oops. And the thing is that in the merchant repository, I know that I already have a method called find by ID. That's already built, so I just leverage that. And so now, where item, here we go. This returns me, this here is going to, I'm just going to go up, reach over, pull, come back down, and now I have a merchant object, right? Am I done? Nope, not quite done. I need to grab its name. I'll just put a name at the end of it because it's the, you have a, because with the merchant object, we have the name here. This, where was I? This here, this merchant name is a bit of a contrived example because it's not asked you that. Like the more the more common thing to do is like you would just I would just have a merchant object, a merchant method, and it would grab you the merchant. So now every single time when you start to getting to the more advanced business intelligence queries, I've already done this, and every single time I have an item, I have access to the merchant right there. I've done this. Like this is done. Like I will always have this. And this simplifies and abstracts away the stuff you need to be doing. If we go on the flip side, we have a merchant, and this is probably the one you're going to use more, is that wouldn't it be nice if I had a method in the merchant object called items, plural, that would just return me an array of item objects that belong to this merchant. And you do essentially the same thing going up and around. And so essentially I would have something like items, and this, I would, engine, repository dot find items by merchant ID. And this is merchant ID, I'll pass myself, like, oops, that. Right. And now, like, why I like using methods like this at the kind of lower level is that this gives me this great opportunity to reuse this code. What if I wanted to know how many items this merchant sold? Well, def items sold. I can just do items dot count. I do def items, and I would do items dot each do item puts like that. Right. And so like what I've done by creating this method that grants me all the items is that every single time I need to go get all the items, I just call this method instead. I reuse it. Using this approach allows us to reuse our code and not have to do like the same kind of traversal over and over again. And thus simplifying our code. Alex?
Would you want to, or is it bad to save repository, or save your, so the diff items, like save your item there? Like you can memorize that variable, but I mean, that means you're like spending more space, but it seems like an opportunity that you could do that. So you're not always like, I gotta go find this every single time, I go over.
Yeah, memoization is one of those. Yeah, I'm sorry, please continue.
Well, yeah, I was just trying to see if there was like if that was a good idea, bad idea when you're worrying about space versus execution time. I don't know what matters.
So memoization is definitely one of the techniques that you will use if you want to break that 5-second mark. When I did when I did Black Thursday over the break, I quickly got tired with how long it was taking for my spec harness to run. So I started to, right from the start, start using memoization pretty heavily to kind of bring that down. And it brought it down pretty significantly. Give me a second. I actually wrote, I made notes. Give me a second here. I don't know where I wrote it down, but I did start to shave minutes off my spec harness time by using memoization. So like even on I would say, if you look at the CSVs, like if we look at the customer CSV, that's only 64 kilobytes of data, relatively very small. And like, I want to say like all said and done, it's 1.5 megs for the invoice items, transactions. Come on, 426 kilobytes. So I would say all said and done, this is less than 10 megabytes of data. If I can shave minutes off of 10 megabytes of data, think about like what advantages you can do with a little light memoization when you're dealing with like gigabytes of data, right? On a relatively, let's say, a modern computer. So like that's definitely a technique I would leverage. Memoization, I would say, is optional. You don't have to use it, but it just makes life a little easier if you're doing it right. Cool. Regina?
This may be a step backwards, but can you show me where find items by merchant ID is defined?
Find items by merchant ID?
Yeah.
I haven't made that yet. I was just using it as an example. Yep.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yep. So I was just like saying, that's how I do it. The analog is like this here, merchant, find merchant by ID, and then over here on the item repository, I have that there.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? That is the meat of the discussion for today. That technique of passing things. Oh, yep, Regina.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize.
So in that initialize right there, it
This
takes, yes, 2 arguments, data and repository. Sorry if this is stepping backwards. I'm just
no. Don't apologize. No. You're no longer allowed to apologize for questions.
Okay. So it takes 2 arguments, data and repository. Repository is down below that and it equals repository. Oh, and
Yep, because we're
Okay.
passing self here when we create the item.
okay, I think I just need to stare at that for a second. Sorry.
Take a screenshot. Take a
Okay.
screenshot if you want.
Okay. Okay.
Also, this video will be up on YouTube, so there's that. Chris?
Yeah, you were about to say something about how this ties into making mocks and stubs. Is there,
Yeah.
you could maybe elaborate, just kind of paint us a little bit of a picture of how we might set that up?
Yeah. So the idea here is that when we are testing, let's say our item, right? We want to test that this thing hit, that we're testing this method, right? What we do is that when we instantiate an item, when we test this, like we're expecting that repositories get passed down to item. But the idea is what we don't want to initialize an entire new item repository just to test the item, right? That just seems gross. I'm like, why would I instantiate another object and then have that object instantiate a lot of items if I'm really just testing this, right? So what we do is that you pass through a mock or a stub when you create the item. And then you test. You only really need to test that this method is getting hit, right? And then like whatever comes back, like that's whatever. You can set up so it returns a merchant item. Merchant item? Yeah, merchant item. Merchant object here, right? Because we don't need to test that it goes. We don't want to test that it goes up. We just want to test that it touches the partner next to it, right? That's like kind of the big picture. We want to make sure it can reach, it is talking to that. The parts that we want to be specific about testing is when we go downwards. We want to test that a merchant can find any merchant by ID. We want to test that a sales engine can talk to a merchant repository that can talk to, we want to test downwards. We never test upwards, right? Because the heavy lifting is essentially all that is only being done downwards. And that's what we want to make sure. Like the reaching of upward, we just need to make sure that it is talking and it's asking, it's hitting the right method. That's one way in which that for our own testing, we can like speed that along. Is that we do not have to like for every single individual test, load up all the data, create all the objects. We don't need to do that at lower levels. Did that answer your question? Or at least got around to it?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jake?
So when we're talking about things taking like 10 minutes, we're specifically talking about like running the spec harness, not the actual program itself, generally speaking.
Both.
Cool. Okay.
Right. So the idea is that like every single time, like the thing is that you're never running this program. It's nothing that we have instructions and like, oh, this is how you start it up and get it going. Like that's not going to be a thing that happens. Like we verify that things are working through the spec harness and your test suite.
Cool.
Yeah, like we used to joke that this is like the most unsatisfying project you work on because it's like you hit enter, you see the colored dots, like yay, I did it. Look what I just spent the last 2 weeks working on. Bunch of colored dots. Aren't you proud, mom and dad? It's not really a program you show off to people, unfortunately.
Unless they care about spec harness.
Yeah. Regina, is that an old hand or a new hand?
Sorry, old hand.
Okay, it's all right. So that essentially is the the kind of like big idea about what we want to talk about today. Like we expect that the expectation is that to pass this project, you'll be using this kind of structure and format. One thing I do want to call out specifically, this is something I do not want to see. this chaining. This is what breaks the law of the meter. When you like, the idea is that you only should be reaching out to the objects adjacent to you, not your objects adjacent to. Right. So you are reaching, this is fine, and having another method there, this is not a fine. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions? And it's okay. It is also okay if you don't have any questions, because this is better seen through your own practice. And this video will be put on YouTube, and we'll also answer questions about this in Slack if you have any. Cool. All right, you're all set. Have a good rest of your afternoon. I'll be meeting from 3 to 4. Let me know if you need anything.